Paul, thanks for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure, and I wanted to thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and perhaps some of your audience. So my name is Paul Bartha. I'm professor of philosophy at UBC, where I've been for quite a while, since 1995. I did a undergraduate degree in mathematics in Toronto, and then a PhD in philosophy in Pittsburgh. And I've written a book about reasoning by analogies, and I've co-edited a book on Pascal's wager. I've also co-authored a mathematics textbook. And generally, I would say I'm interested in unusual, somewhat mysterious arguments and forms of reasoning. That's sort of the general way to describe my interests. I think reasoning by analogy is a big interest for me. Uh, we use analogical reasoning all the time. So a good example would be Charles Darwin's initial argument that in order to make plausible this idea of natural selection as able to account for variety, we look to artificial selection. We look at how much breeders have been able to accomplish. And basically, analogies are a very important form of reasoning, and that's sort of my main interest. Um, the other big interest for me is decision theory, which is how we make rational decisions. And relevant to this topic is I have a special interest in making decisions where some of the outcomes are really good or really bad. So Pascal's wager is kind of an entry point for me to this, because you're making a decision where one of the outcomes is supposed to be really good, right? The outcome where you believe in God and God exists. But I'm also quite interested in environmental philosophy, where we're dealing with potentially really, really bad outcomes that have unknown probability, and we're in a position where we have to make decisions where some catastrophic outcome might occur. So it's kind of like the mirror image of Pascal's wager, and that's kind of been a recent focus for me. So I was interested in developing machinery for thinking about these kinds of decisions, and that's sort of where my interest in Pascal's wager comes from. So I'll just preface this by saying I'm not by training a philosopher of religion, and I'm totally happy to acknowledge flaws in Pascal's argument and try to make it better and look at ways to think of this in terms of decision theory. So I'll stop there. I've probably gone on longer than you wanted already. So thanks for the chance to introduce myself.
Yeah, absolutely. So tell me more about what is Pascal's wager and what is your position on it? What is your interpretation of it?
Yeah, so that's a good way to start. Um, And I would say traditionally, there's a sort of traditional presentation of the argument, which is an extension of gambling, the kind of reasoning you use in a gambling argument. We're all familiar with this idea of calculating expected value, where you do a kind of a weighted average of payoff and probability. So maybe buying a lottery ticket is a good gamble if, even though there's a small chance of winning, the prize might be really large, and you multiply the probability times the value, and that's called the expected value. So um, when you're trying to decide ordinary things, you do these expected value calculations, and then you pick the action that maximizes expected value. This is a familiar principle in decision theory and in economics. We generalize from money to what's called utility. It's sort of an abstract representation of how much you value things, and it's more widely applicable than just money. Okay, so what Pascal did, actually, Pascal's wager is often considered the very first decision theory argument. He's considered to be the inventor of probability and also decision theory. And it's kind of ironic that the very first argument used infinite utility. He has this idea of infinite payoff if you believe in God and God exists. And what that means is, as long as the probability that God exists is positive, any small positive number times infinity is infinity. Um, Whereas if you don't believe in God, you deprive yourself of this chance of an infinite payoff. And most people think for Pascal, he doesn't involve a negative infinity. He just says, at most, there's a finite reward if you disbelieve. So, so the nice thing about this argument is it's not supposed to depend on the probability that God exists. As long as it's positive, the expected value of believing is infinite. The expected value of not believing or not wagering is finite, so you should wager. Now, this argument is vulnerable to some really, really well-known and really good objections. And that little article I sent you from Philosopher's Magazine, I don't know if you had a chance to look, but I should have sent you that earlier. But it really, this argument arouses a lot of contempt because it looks incredibly mercenary, this calculation. It's inauthentic. It's even for somebody who takes religion seriously, it looks like they're being motivated in the wrong way to believe. It looks inauthentic, and it seems to violate a lot of our normal ethics of belief, because normally we try to proportion our belief to the evidence. Um, and also mathematically, it's sort of dodgy. How does this argument really work? You know, how does this multiplication with infinity go? So I thought, I kind of agree with a lot of these criticisms, but I still think there's something to this argument. And I think the starting point for me is the fact that we do in our lives not, we don't, in fact, confine ourselves to the evidence all the time. We make commitments that sometimes go beyond what the evidence shows. And so if we're able to do this, there's something to be made of this argument. And the way I tried to deal with the argument is to come up with a better way of thinking about infinite utility, and a better representation of the argument, and also to introduce what I call an evolutionary perspective on the argument. So on the first point, maybe it's complicated and is a separate question, but this idea of infinite utility, um, it can seem absurd, right, for finite human beings to have infinite utility. Um, and here I'll just try to briefly sketch my idea, which is, if we distinguish between two traditions for thinking about utility, there's a kind of an earlier British empiricist tradition that goes back to Mill and Bentham, where you think of utility as kind of like a measure of how much happiness or pleasure you're feeling. And infinite utility makes no sense if that's the way we think of utility, because we're finite creatures. We can't experience infinite happiness or pleasure. But then there's this 20th century tradition where utilities are a kind of abstraction, a device for representing preferences. This is von Neumann Morgenstern. And on this tradition, I think the way to make sense of infinite utility is simply, um, a person who has a discontinuity and is unwilling to make certain kinds of trade-offs. It's actually easier to understand with negative infinity. So you might be unwilling to take certain chances that would involve ethically unacceptable outcomes. A good example of this is work on the atomic bomb that was done. They went at a certain point during the Manhattan Project, the scientists became worried that a detonation of a nuclear bomb might ignite the atmosphere and destroy the whole world. So they actually stopped their work while they went through the calculations. Um, and then they decided it wasn't a realistic possibility. So here's a case where the destruction of the world, it might not be literally infinitely bad, but in a kind of a practical sense, they were unwilling to make trade-offs, right? They were unwilling to take action where there was a chance that this might destroy the world. So, so I think in this kind of pragmatic sense, we can think of infinite or negative infinite utility in terms of what trade-offs we're unwilling to make. So that was the first step I took, to make sense of infinite utility. And then there's a sort of a mathematical machinery for representing this that I won't go into. Uh, this is, I'm part of my problem with this talk is I'm not sure how much detail I should be going into. The other,
Well, just to start, what is Pascal's wager? Could you give a description of what
oh, I'm
Pascal's wager
sorry.
is?
The very simple, yeah, the very simple argument. You think of a 2x2 decision table. This is the easiest way to understand Pascal's original argument, that you have a choice between wagering for God, which means taking steps to believe, and not wagering, which means ignoring the whole thing or actually trying not to believe. So you have two choices, and there are two possible states of the world. Either God exists or God doesn't exist. This is the original version. If you wager and God exists, there's an infinite payoff. That's the top left corner of this 2x2 table. If you wager and God doesn't exist, then there's some finite outcome. You've wasted a lot of time. It's bad. Um, if you don't wager, all of the outcomes are finite utilities. God, whether God exists or God doesn't exist, you're not going to get an infinite reward. So so what you do is you calculate the expected value of each action. On the first row, wagering for God, its probability that God exists is, if that's positive, call it P. P times infinity plus 1 minus P times some finite value is infinite. So the expected value of wagering is infinite. The expected value of not wagering for God is finite. So the argument is that you should wager for God as long as the probability is positive. So that's the basic argument. That's that's and that's subject to a lot of objections. So in my version, it's similar, except that we understand this infinite utility as not absolute infinity. Um, it's uh, it's basically what I call a relative infinity. It's just saying that you you prefer the outcome where God exists and you gamble, as long as there's any chance you're willing to take the gamble. So I'm part of the problem with understanding my version of the argument is, if you represent this as infinite, you're already in a position where you're acknowledging this possibility that there could be this outcome that's high, that you value very highly, more highly than any finite outcome. So I don't know. I'm not sure. Maybe I'll let you ask more questions.
Yeah. So my response to Pascal's wager is usually that the probability of an infinite reward in an afterlife seems equally as high with or without a God. It seems like the assumption that not believing in God necessarily has a finite outcome seems false, and there could be an afterlife without a God just as probabilistically as there could be one with a God, and there's no reason to prefer one hypothesis over the other. And that seems like it would defeat the argument entirely from my perspective.
So I see. So your objection is that the probability is insensitive to whether you believe or not.
Yeah, so like there could be a heaven for atheists. Like say there's no
Right.
God. There's like a Buddhist kind of a karmic field or whatever, just the universe, no God whatsoever. And your consciousness goes to this karmic field of bliss and whatever it's called. And so you can have a heaven of infinite reward without a God. In which case, given all the possible hypothetical ways the God could be, there's many that would not allow a heaven, or many that would send atheists to heaven, or whatever. And there's equal probabilistic assignments of a potential heavens under a naturalistic universe. So there could be a heaven for atheists, a heaven for people who pick their nose on a Tuesday, heaven for Christians, whatever. And so the actual probability of you getting to heaven is exactly the same whether or not you believe in God, whether or not there is a God.
Right. So I guess part of the response to this is to acknowledge that if this is your belief structure, I think it has to be admitted that Pascal's wager has no purchase for certain initial belief configurations. Uh, so somebody who, for example, who thinks there's zero probability that God exists, the wager has no purchase on that person, and I'm not disputing this. I guess similarly, somebody who thinks that that wagering has no influence at all, the wager is going to be impotent. I totally agree. Um, so in a way, maybe this gets into this evolutionary perspective that I wanted to introduce. Part of what I'm arguing in that paper that I sent you is that um, what you need to look at is what is the stability of your position, your probability assignments. So for many people, that's not the case. They don't start with your initial theology, as it were. um, that that you have you start with a background theology where uh, there's a higher probability of this reward if God exists and if you believe in God. Uh, and in that situation, the argument that I'm making is the if you look at the if you do the probability calculation or do the utility calculation, then the expected utility of believing in God is higher than not believing. Wagering is higher than not wagering, and it's there's no stable positions except when that probability converges towards 1 or 0. So I think it partly is relative to your starting position, whether Pascal's wager has any pull at all. And the other thing I want to say, just to acknowledge your point, there are sort of there are philosophers like Elliot Sober who think that part of the problem with Pascal's wager is that it's not sufficiently pragmatic. That is, he doesn't look at this background theology. So it's exactly the kind of thing you're doing. Um, that if you don't, the only thing Pascal allows you to be pragmatic about is whether you believe in God or not. But Pascal is holding fixed this background theology that that people who believe go to heaven and atheists don't go to heaven. Let's leave out hell because it's not clear in Pascal that hell is in there. But anyway, there's this background theology that Pascal is holding fixed, and Sober says no, you should allow that to also be variable. So I would maybe say this to you as well that um, you shouldn't hold fixed this background theology that there could be equal probability. But I'm sort of entrapped in a little way by my own views because the way my argument works is you start from some position with some probability distribution, and then you apply this kind of equilibrium test. Like if you do think there's this probability that God exists and infinite reward, you should look at the expected utilities and decide whether your position is stable, right? And I have this little mechanism for how the probability should evolve. But the main point is if one option is doing better than the other, you should start shifting your probabilities in favor of that option, right? And in your view, you're starting with a tie. So there's absolutely no impetus to change. So I actually basically want to agree. Maybe this is not a great move, but I'm willing to admit that if you start with certain background assumptions, it's very hard for this argument to shift you. Um, as I said, I'm interested in this making sense of this argument um, for the sake of decision theory, but I'm willing to admit it's not going to work for everybody, and it
So
won't shift everybody. Yeah.
So the next question I would have is that since Pascal's wager was designed to be something that you can look at as a reason to believe without evidence, if there's no evidence, then it seems like the only rational assumption is to take the position that I'm taking, where there's no probabilistic difference one way or the other. The only way to come to the conclusion that a heaven under a God is more likely than a heaven without a God is that you need some evidence. There has to be some reason to think that's the case. But if you don't have that, then it seems the rational position to take is the one that there is no evidential difference one way or the other.
So you're applying some kind of insufficient reason here, like that in cases of ignorance we should assign equal probability to each outcome, right? Something like that. This is sort of a classical principle. So,
Yeah, yeah. So,
and it,
like, if we don't have any evidence one way or the other, whether or not there's a heaven, whether or not there's a God, and whether or not there is a kind of God that would make a heaven, we also have no evidence that whether or not there is a natural heaven, whether or not it would be inclined based off a certain kind of naturalism. And so, the probability that there is a naturalism that creates a heaven versus a God that creates the heaven, if we have no evidence, seems exactly identical. I don't see any reason to think that there would be one that would be more probable than the other unless we have some evidence to indicate this kind of God exists or this kind of universe exists or vice versa. And so until we actually have evidence to indicate that this being exists or not, it seems like there is no reason to think that a universe without a God is any less likely to produce a heaven than a universe with a God. I don't see any reason without evidence to infer one is more likely than the other.
Right. So let me think about this a minute. I mean, this is sort of a this. I think the argument is sort of historically. Historically, this wouldn't have been a position, right, in the for someone like Pascal in the 18th century. But your point is today. I guess.
Well,
Um,
I think I don't want to put it historically because I want to say that at all points in time, this would have been the rational position. It would have been more rational to think that the probability that a universe could produce a heaven on its own was the exact same as a God producing a heaven. And so, if we grant Pascal's premise that there is no evidence at this time, we're just trying to look at it from a utility standpoint, we should never have considered the possibility that a universe without a God was less likely to produce a heaven. I think that was always a begging the question kind of an assumption with no evidence, which seems counterproductive to the rationality of the argument. It seems like if we are pure logic machines and we're trying to assess how should we how should we evaluate this argument, um, prior to considering any evidence for whether or not God exists or not, just looking at, is it logically possible that a God would produce a heaven? Yes. Is it logically possible God would not produce a heaven? Also, yes. Um, Ask the same question: is it logically possible a universe would produce a heaven or afterlife? Yes. Is it logically possible it would not? Also, yes. And so, if you compare all the different possible ways God could be and all the different possible ways the universe could be, it seems like there's a one-to-one correlation of the number that would produce a heaven, the number that would not produce a heaven, and the criterions by which they would establish who would get into heaven. And so I think at all points in time, whether they realized it or not, the rational conclusion is to assess that there's no probabilistic difference between a heaven with a God and a heaven without a God. And the only reason they didn't assume that was because of their personal biases, which seemed rationally unfounded without considering evidence.
okay, it's a good argument. I guess. I mean, part of the point I would make here is like when I sent you the paper in the paper, I acknowledge that the issue not addressed by me is exactly this point about the probability of God existing, and there's a parallel point here to be made about the background probability of the theological viewpoint. I think is kind of. I still think what you're addressing is a kind of a background theological position that it's no more likely that heaven would exist with God or without God. Um, and I and by assumption, Pascal's argument is working without evidence, and Pascal himself says all of these traditional arguments about God are futile proofs; they don't work. Um, so so I think I have to simply acknowledge that my argument is taking as its starting point a person who doesn't have that theological position. So I basically, it's still not going to satisfy you because you're going to say I need to give some argument for any asymmetric probability. Like if the starting probability is irrational, um, if somebody starts with a higher probability for heaven if God exists than if God doesn't exist, is that an irrational assumption? I'm not. I'm not convinced by you that it's irrational. I'm totally persuaded by you that it's a perfectly rational position to start with equality, right? But I think um, when you're talking about initial credences or subjective probabilities, in the case of no evidence, there's a long history of trying to make sense of these assumptions of equal probability. And there, I mean, there's one version of Pascal's argument actually in the Pensée, where Pascal actually seems to be saying, well, God exists or he doesn't. We have no evidence, so 50% chance that God exists, 50% chance that God doesn't exist. And that's Ian Hacking says that's a monstrous application of the principle of indifference, right? To either God exists or he doesn't, so it's 50% chance of either. Um, I'm willing to concede that the probability that God exists is well below 50%. So, but yet there's no evidence for that, right? So what I'm saying is we don't always strictly apply this principle of indifference in cases uh, of no evidence, right? We don't really have evidence. Some people think maybe we do have evidence against God's existence. I would say we start with a kind of these credences reflect our dispositions to believe, and it's I don't think it's always obvious that where we have no evidence, we have some kind of obvious equal distribution of probabilities. So just as it's not obvious we should assign 50% to God exists and 50% to not, I think people could start with different background beliefs, and my argument really only gets started once you have some initial distribution. Basically, I guess I'm saying I'm willing to admit that that is a perfectly reasonable position, but not maybe that it's mandatory. I don't know if that will persuade you, but
Oh yeah,
I
absolutely.
yeah.
Well, so my position here is that I think that Pascal's argument is only compelling if someone already has a bias that heaven under a god is more likely than heaven under a universe. And if that position isn't justified, if it's an unjustified position, then Pascal's wager only works to reinforce an unjustified bias, which means I don't think it's a particularly useful argument. It seems more like what fallacies do. They reinforce an unjustified bias. In the first case, where if he's presenting this argument with no evidence, um, if there was evidence, then the argument seems pointless because, like, if you already have evidence God exists, what's the point of the argument? You don't need to consider it. You already have evidence, and so the evidence makes the argument pointless. And if considering a rational position that probabilities are the same, whether there's a heaven with or without a God, if that makes the argument pointless, it seems like the only useful way for the argument to be compelling is if someone already has a bias for more benefit under a God than a non God. And if that isn't justified, then it seems like all the argument can do is just reinforce a bias, which makes it entirely pointless.
Okay, so I think I agree that there has to be a slight initial bias. It doesn't have to be great, but you need to have an asymmetry. And of course, if you had the asymmetry going the other way, that that would be you probably don't agree with that bias either. That uh, heaven is more likely if God doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So I actually I'm not unhappy with this. Uh, that that you have to start with. I mean, we this is a weakness of the argument. I agree. You're dealing with an argument that isn't based on evidence, um, and in a way, what the paper is arguing is that a kind of stability of your beliefs is a necessary condition for rationality, not that it's sufficient. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you have a distribution of probabilities where there's more weight given towards wagering than not wagering, that kind of should lead to a boost in your wagering, and you have an unstable position, right? So that's really the takeaway position I'm arguing for is that um, if we have an ability to make a wager, and if we're able sometimes to make commitments without full evidence, um, then there's a requirement of stability, a kind of equilibrium requirement that's a necessary condition. But I'm willing to concede it's not sufficient, because you could criticize the initial probability distribution. I guess part of my problem is I'm steeped in this tradition of subjective probabilities where the initial starting probabilities, people like Richard Jeffrey and others, where your initial set of subjective probabilities has only very, very minimal criteria of rationality. And often in this tradition, people are very suspicious of applications of principle of indifference, right? So it's part of my issue when I'm talking to you or others, is that I forget like all this stuff that people don't wouldn't necessarily agree with or know about. But basically, a lot of these views, they start with your initial set of probabilities, and the only requirement is that they be mathematically coherent. You don't get probabilities that add up to more than one or whatever. So they're
No
all
logical
any
contradictions. Logical
starting set
contradictions
of
are out.
probabilities is okay. So that I am sort of starting with that position, and I agree. there isn't really a good way to justify in any convincing way. So
All right,
I'm
so
sorry
let's.
I'm missing all. I can't look at all these
Oh, that's
questions.
you
I
can
wish.
ignore the comments.
I'm
I'll read the
sorry.
questions at the end.
I'm glad people are interested. Part of the thing I want to say is like, whatever your view, a lot of people really hate this argument. Um, but I'm just glad that people are interested, and I think it's kind of fun. Whatever you think of this argument, it's interesting to think about it. Um, so so I'm happy people are here, and I'm just sorry I can't answer all their questions.
Oh yeah, don't worry. I'll ask the questions at the end. I'm keeping a list
Okay.
of the side ones, so you just ignore that. That's mostly for the
Yeah,
people in the
I'm
audience
trying.
to.
Every once in a while, I look over and I see, oh yeah, good question, and I can't keep track of it all. So yeah,
So let's
okay.
grant, for the sake of the argument, that we have some bias that heaven under God is more likely. Then how does your argument work?
Yeah. So what? As I said, it's a little hard. I'm in a way I was surprised you picked that article because it's sort of a little bit technical, but the basic thing is there's a lot of problems with the original argument. um, what do we make? How do you do this mathematics with infinity and everything? But but basically, I have a way. I in my representation, you just represent the difference between the infinite and finite rewards by putting a one. This is a simple way of putting it. You put a one for the infinite rewards and a zero for the finite payoffs. So the decision matrix has a one in the top left where you believe in God exists or where you wager in God exists, and a zero for all of the other boxes, right? And then as long as the probability that God exists is positive, you get an argument for wagering. Um, however, the second part of my argument is it's not like it's a single decision that you make once and for all and it's over. Even Pascal talks about setting out on a road. And like if you decide there's something to wagering, then um, basically there might be some kind of boost to your probability, but it's not over. You have to reconsider this wager repeatedly through your life, right? And so the idea is that we're looking for an equilibrium, a set of a probability distribution that is not self-undermining, but is kind of stable. And the only ones are where the probabilities are zero or one. So really, in a way, the position is a kind of a pragmatic critique of um, an agnostic position, which is ironic because evidentially speaking, the agnostic position is the most reasonable one, right? Where you just have some probability that's not zero or one. Um, but in Pascal's wager is kind of arguing that that's an unstable position pragmatically, because except for your version, sorry, where the probability is insensitive to your belief, right? But basically, if the if your if the belief makes a difference to the payoff, then there's no stable position except probability one or zero. Atheism or theism are kind of the stable positions from a pragmatic point of view. So that's kind of the argument. I don't know if that's clear.
Yeah,
If
yeah.
you,
So I
yeah,
think what you're saying is that if you have a bias where you think heaven is more likely under one of the hypotheses, then because of that, taking the initiative to make a wager would be probabilistically beneficial to you because one side has more possibilities for the higher outcome than the other. And therefore, if you have this bias remaining agnostic, um, you have a plausible reason to not remain agnostic simply for the possibility of the payout because you have this bias that leads one way to the other, that one has a
yeah,
higher likelihood to get the outcome than the other.
there's it's and actually I think now that I think of it, if you actually believed it was more likely heaven was more likely for those who wager against, it would go in the opposite direction. It would push you towards rejecting the wager completely. So
Yeah.
again, it sounds weird, but I'm really thinking of this in decision theory terms, not as a philosophy of religion. Like I'm
Yep.
not, and I really don't like the arm twisty idea of Pascal's wager as a coercive device to push people into believing. Like that's not my view at all. And I think and actually I doubt a single person has maybe okay maybe there I have heard stories about people on their deathbed who kind of appealed to Pascal's wager, but I don't like this idea. I do think it can be it can be useful for people who are trying to think about whether to kind of throw religion completely out the window, to say, well, there is this pragmatic argument, and it's worth a kind of element of open-mindedness, to that's sort of the way I see this argument working. It's not like you ever would make a single decision, and even Pascal doesn't think this way, that this argument is all you need, right? He's addressing an audience of people who he thinks of as hardened skeptics who really are more or less hostile to religion, and that the wager is simply an opening move to really kind of soften them up. So anyway, so as I say, I think it's a limited goal. The way the article is stated actually is it's mainly about this many gods problem, and how I said if you accept certain premises that drive the original argument, then you have tools to respond to the many gods objection. But anyway, so I do have very limited view about this argument, but I still think it's more interesting than most of the other theological arguments. Um, and it's like it's connected to all kinds of interesting ideas, infinite value, decision theory. It's connected to these environmental arguments, which I find pretty important. So that's kind of where my interest comes in this argument. And I'm not sure whether that's satisfactory to you or your audience, but that's kind
Oh
of
yeah, for sure.
like,
My I was just bringing up the original criticisms as what I typically talk about, and then I definitely am
sure.
interested in hearing your response of how does your article respond to the many gods hypothesis and relates to that response to Pascal's wager.
Yeah, so that's okay. So I think that's a really deep objection, right? That you the initial decision problem was just two columns: God exists, God doesn't exist, and and since you get the infinite payoff on the first column, you should wager for God. And Pascal's contemporaries immediately pointed out that this argument would work for, I think, an imam could reason this way, said, this was the objection. So depending on your conception of God, you need more columns and more rows, right? You could wager for all of these other deities. And so an initial the initial problem here is simply with the representation of the payoff as infinity. And the poverty of our mathematics is, um, p times infinity equals infinity, right? Whenever p is a positive probability. So in every row, you're getting infinite payoff, right? So now, if you think about it, though, if the probabilities are different, there's something slightly wrong with that mathematical argument, right? Like, let's say you're raised, just for the sake of argument, you're raised as a Christian, and you're somewhat skeptical now, but you have a higher probability for some kind of Christian deity than for another, but you assign some probability to the others. Then there might be some reason to think, well, if there's an infinite reward, I want to go with the highest probability, right? I'm putting this in mercenary terms here, like just
Mhm.
in terms of gambling. I'm setting aside these objections about how inauthentic this would be. But just as a decision theory argument, there seems to be something wrong with equating each of these wagers that has a possible infinite reward, but different probability, right? You should go with the highest probability. And this people had said this, but there wasn't really a rigorous theory for this. So by
So just to
representing
clarify,
all of
you're saying
these,
that there are different probabilities, but any probability that is above zero that is multiplied by infinity would equate to infinity, and so there's no way to distinguish between the different possibilities that have different initial starting values because when you multiply them by infinity, they all equate to infinity.
thank you. And this is why it's good to have you here and not me, because you express it perfectly. So basically, this is one version of the many gods objection: is that as long as you have more than one column with non-zero probability, they're all equal. They're all tied. They're all equal infinite expected value, right? This is the simplest version of the many gods objection. And I jumped into the reply, which is, well, if we're just thinking of this as decision theory, if you had two boxes in front of you with infinite prize in them, whatever that means, and one has a 99% chance and the other is 1% chance of winning, you're going to pick the 99%, right? Because even though mathematically they all come out to 0.99 times infinity and 0.01 times infinity, they're both infinity. There's something wrong with them. The mathematics seems to be not doing the job here, right?
Yeah.
So in fact, the first step I took by I gave a finite gloss to the infinite reward. This is the machinery is not worth trying to explain, but you end up with a representation where you use ones and zeros, one for infinity, zero for finite. So this allows you to distinguish between the different many gods that have different probabilities. So this is just the first level of replying to the many gods objection. That it actually the problem you need a decision theory. People call this non-standard decision theory. So we need a decision theory that can acknowledge that the probabilities make a difference, and you should go with the higher probability. So that's just the first response to this many gods problem, because you could still have a tie. You could still have gods with equal probability. It's kind of like your example with the theological view that it makes it, and there are all sorts of, so far I'm only considering what we might call jealous gods who only reward their believers. What about these gods who reward believers? Like I call them grouchy gods, right? Who they reward people who believe in some other god. Or
Yep.
what about a god who rewards an
Someone who,
atheist?
if you
Yeah,
pick your nose on a Tuesday, only the people who
someone
pick their
here,
nose on a
God's the
Tuesday.
sidewalk crack example, that
Mhm.
people who don't step on sidewalk cracks go to heaven and everything. So there's a lot more to say about this many gods objection. And that's kind of the point of that article, which it looks at this basically, just as an example. If you look at the God who rewards people who don't believe in that God, then if you follow my argument, you would be justified in wagering against that God, but you're actually undermining the basis for that belief. Like, as your probability for that possibility drops, you're actually undermining the argument for that belief. So once you introduce an evolutionary perspective, it kind of favors jealous gods. And I actually think this is sort of a sociological tool here for Pascal's wager, that, like, why do we see a fairly prevalent or a number of these jealous gods, the ones that reward? This kind of an argument for this, right, in terms of Pascal's wager, that the ones who I said, the nice gods who reward everybody, universalist gods, in some ways they're the most moral ones, right? Like, why should we distinguish between those who believe without evidence and those who don't? But in terms of Pascal's wager, there's no point in believing in these gods because they reward everyone anyway, right? So it's kind of weird to take this decision theory perspective, but if you're going to go that route, you have to take it seriously, right? So you can't just ignore these unpleasant conclusions. So
Yeah, that
anyway,
makes
so
sense. So, like, from a probabilistic standpoint, if the God's gonna let you in whether or not you believe, you should, believe in the one that won't do that because
that's
that's
right.
the only one that makes any difference to you getting into heaven. The nice one's gonna let you in either way, so who cares?
Yeah. So in the article, I said nice gods finish last, right? Because, like, they don't they don't seem to have any. There's no real reason to wager for them. But when we step outside Pascal's wager, there's something wrong with that. I'm I'm willing to say Pascal wager is by no means the whole story here. Um, and I'm as I say, my focus is as a decision theory perspective. And philosophy of religion, it's going to have a lot more things to say about this problem of universalist deities. So, but anyway,
So
I
from
do think it's interesting to think about it sort of sociologically, why we have this prevalence of jealous gods. So,
Oh, for sure, and I think there's lots of other problems you could go with Pascal's wager. Like,
yeah,
one of the things I find interesting is that it's this finite reward or punishment thing. If you choose to believe in God and devote your life, like suppose you mentioned that it's more than just choosing to believe at one instance. You have to continually reassess the decision throughout your life. And suppose that this God requires that you do a bunch of very particular things to get into heaven. Be celibate, don't do drugs, don't drink alcohol, don't have fun, no music, no rock and roll, no Harry Potter, whatever. If you have to sacrifice a lot of things in your life, now the probabilities seem to change slightly because there's a consequence. You're losing something. If there isn't a God and you devote your life to worshiping this God, you've lost all of the potential happiness you have. And so, even if there's only a finite amount of happiness, you get zero happiness, and that's the only life you have. Whereas if somebody ignores that and takes the risk of not getting the infinite reward, they get to enjoy the positive amount of life that they do have without living under these constraints that they don't get to be happy. I think that's another interesting constraint for Pascal's wager too.
I
I,
I think
how,
it's really important. And so, like, and in fact, this is really, I've started to think more about this problem because, so if you look at, in fact, in Pascal's wager, what kind of he kind of says this, that that this is the top right column. I know I don't have PowerPoint here. Imagine this 2 by 2 table is up on the screen, and the right column, top right column, is where you believe in God does not exist. That's shouldn't it's we just say, oh, that's merely finite, but in fact it's pretty bad, right? It's you put a lot of effort into religious belief, and maybe you've sacrificed a lot, and turns out God doesn't exist. So that's it's not it's finite. But it's bad. It's not a good. And whereas in those people on the bottom row who just ignored the wager, they have this good life whether God exists or not. And we're ignoring here hell. I mean, I'm just that would be the bottom left column where God exists and you don't believe in. So we're setting that aside because I think Pascal doesn't use it in his argument. But so so what are we supposed to say about this? Because strictly speaking, it remains true on Pascal's wager that if you put this infinity in the top left box, it outweighs the cost of the sacrifice, right? No matter how tiny the probability, it outweighs it. And so for me, like I was troubled by this because I think the argument, like the strength of the argument is this infinite number in the top left, which makes it work no matter how tiny the probability, right? That's kind of the appeal of the argument, but it's also the source of all of the worst objections, including this one, that okay, it doesn't matter how tiny the probability and how much the sacrifice, you should still do this wager, right? And so so in the paper I sent you, I think a week ago, this one I just wrote, and you probably didn't get a chance to look at it, but I was I was looking at the parallel case of precautionary reasoning in environmental philosophy because it's we have an exactly parallel situation where we're trying to prevent disastrous catastrophic climate change, um, or actually let's use a different example, asteroid collision. Okay, so this is actually, I like this example. So we know there's a chance that an asteroid will hit the earth, and NASA actually has a budget for looking at near earth objects and trying to develop technology. They sent that device, that rocket, to deflect an object. So why can't we argue, like Pascal, that NASA's entire budget should go towards asteroid interception, right? Like, why should we be building the Webb telescope and trying to go to Mars, and all of NASA's budget should be devoted to detecting near Earth objects and developing technology to intercept asteroids, right? If we represent this outcome where an asteroid hits the Earth as infinitely bad, it's exactly parallel to Pascal's wager, right? So this a good analogy for the?
sure.
I think it's a good analogy. So we thought I'm working with a few others on this, and what we tried to do now is develop this model where you're thinking about these environmental problems in terms of resource allocation. So so now you introduce, and basically, um, what you need to do is take into account that, um, basically there's another kind of disaster that can happen when you pour everything into the asteroid collision. It's actually a catastrophe for humanity if no work is being done on space exploration and all these other things, right? It's just a different kind of catastrophe. So you end up with a kind of a balanced model where you do allocate some money towards the asteroid and some towards the Webb telescope, right? And I can't get into details, but I'm trying to bring this back to Pascal's wager, and it wouldn't look anything. I don't think it would make Pascal very happy because I end up saying things like in this article that, if you have a very low probability that God exists, Pascal's wager leads you to, if you use this resource model, you should put some resources into wagering, but not everything, right? So I'm trying to kind of tame the wager. So preserve some part of it, but not let it consume your whole existence where you sacrifice everything. So I think this is hopefully a way forward. It won't please everybody, but I think it's a more balanced view of the wager, is basically bringing back some lessons from this environmental stuff back to Pascal's wager. So I think it's a very fruitful analogy.
So my initial thoughts when hearing that is going back to the mini gods hypothesis, because there could be infinitely different kinds of asteroids. Say there's an asteroid, we could also do super volcanoes, could be a way to destroy us, the sun imploding, or sending a, whatever it's called, the big bursts of radioactive stuff that comes from the sun that could eliminate our atmosphere. There's a bunch of different ways we could all have the infinite punishment or the infinite reward here. And so should we invest resources into each of those? And if we did, then we'd go back to the catastrophe of having no resources for the other stuff. Um, and so using your analogy of saying we should still invest some resources into this possibility, would we also need to invest some in all of the various possible ways that we could have this infinite reward or punishment?
Let's see. Sorry. Okay, so I'm not sure if you're asking about Pascal. Like, are you mostly asking now about this environmental? This is the many disasters problem. Is kind of an analog to the many gods problem, right? That we have. There are these all these many disasters that could happen with tinier and tinier probabilities, right? And um, there's this principle in ethics, the precautionary principle. We could have a separate session on that, but which which is kind of eerily like Pascal's wager, right? That says you should act in such a way to avoid any possibility of catastrophe, and it's vulnerable to almost the same objections as Pascal's wager because there's so many of these possible disasters and there's no way to avoid them all, right?
Well, I'm focusing
So,
specifically on what you said, because you said that
oh,
the
the asteroid.
goal of your paper is to still have a reason to invest some resources into pursuing the God belief or the potential infinite reward,
Yeah.
while also investing resources into the finite thing. And my question is if there are multiple possible infinite rewards or punishments, which doesn't matter which one, and your argument entails that we should invest resources into at least one of these to some degree, would it also entail that we would invest resources into multiple of these if there were multiple possibilities?
Yeah. Not always. It actually, this is a surprisingly subtle topic. It depends on the nature. Like basically, there's a kind of a triage analogy here. Like when you're dealing with a hospital, a battlefield hospital, right? Like it doesn't mean you should try to save every patient, right? Like you can basically ignore the ones who are almost surely going to die or almost surely going to get better on their own, um, and you put the resources where it's going to boost the probability. So there's some way of doing this to maximize the utility, as it were, even though we're dealing with human lives. So we actually, it depends. We call this. There's a distinction between cases where the catastrophes are additive and where they're all terminal. Like so if there's multiple disasters that just make things worse and worse, you get one answer. But if they're all terminal catastrophes where it doesn't actually matter, like if an asteroid hits the Earth, doesn't much matter if another asteroid comes along, a few years later or something. Like it's a terminal catastrophe. So then you just can put all your energy into minimizing the probability of one of these disasters, like
Well,
the
so let
one
me
with
go
the
with
highest
your
probability.
let's go with your analogy of the healthcare triage. So let's say there is 1,000,000 people in the triage, and we can save all of them. All of them could potentially be saved. There's
Each
some
one
percent
could
chance.
potentially be saved.
So like say
Yeah,
that one has a 33% chance, one has a 32.9% chance, one has a 32.8% chance. So we can save all of them potentially. But but if we devote our life to saving as many as possible, because we have, let's say, 100 years to live, and so in this 100 years we could potentially save maybe 1,000 of them. The rest are going to die no matter what. And so we have to choose which ones we're going to invest the time in and how much of a time of our lives we're going to invest in saving people. So
yeah,
I can invest 100% of my life into working to save as many of these people as possible. But that would lead to the catastrophe you were mentioning before, that if we sacrifice all of our resources into the pursuit of this potential life saving thing, we lose all of our personal freedom, our personal investments, the other kinds of investments. And so believing in God would be like, say that's the highest percentage, the 33% one. And then there's another God that's 32.9 and another God that's 32.8. How many of these gods do we invest resources in trying to accommodate for
yeah.
the potential infinite reward?
So this
And
is
how
these are
much?
yeah these are great questions. So the if let me first talk about the triage case, and then I'll come back to the Pascal case. So I think with the triage case, there's actually a disanalogy between the okay. I think there's a disanalogy between the triage case and the Pascal case, which is that that multiple disasters are possible. Like all these people could die, or they could all be saved, or some of them could be saved, some not. But typically, when we're thinking about many gods, we're not actually thinking that more than one of these would exist, right? So, but you could disagree. You could say you could have a theology where there could be all of these gods existing or something. But I'm maybe making an arbitrary assumption that typically we're not thinking of these. We're thinking of these as possibilities, but not like we're not thinking that they could all actually exist, right?
Well,
So
let
maybe
me include that in the analogy. So let's say that there are 1,000,000 doors. We're in a triage and there's 1,000,000 doors, and each door, behind each door, could be a person who's dying, and we're gonna try to save them. And we want to save as many lives as possible. So we don't actually know if there's people there. Maybe there's only one person in one door. But
right.
should we be investing the time to go prepare to check each door? How many doors should we check? If there's a percent chance there's a person behind this door, we have no idea. Maybe there's only one person in one of the doors, but we have to try to assess which one should we invest the time in trying to save.
Yeah. So okay, let me say first of all, I should say I'm still thinking about this stuff. Like I actually think this is what I was thinking about last month is this how to allocate resources. So I don't have a settled answer, but in the case of the triage example, let's first take I'm going to back away from your new version and just say you've got some probabilistic knowledge of the chances of saving these different people. You actually can work out um, a formula, which is you basically allocate resources in such a way that the marginal probabilities are all equal. So it's it uses Lagrange multipliers, believe it or not. But basically, you want if you were to shift resource, like basically you're kind of max your all of the differential, like any distribution change would would impact one probability more negatively than it would benefit another. Something like does this make sense sort of metaphorically? Like
Oh yeah, yeah.
you're
But my
trying
question here
to
is if we
equalize the
take
marginal probabilities.
well,
Sorry?
the part I'm not understanding is how do we assess how much time should you or how much utility should you invest in your personal finite life, which is the finite variable, as opposed to investing in the one
Right.
most likely infinite or the multitude of infinite
Okay.
possibilities.
Right. I didn't address that question at all. I'm imagining you've got this pot of money, call it M, capital M, and you're going to put some part X towards helping these dying people, and the remainder is for you. So I was only talking about the X, how you divide up the X part. Like you're trying to maximum. So, but what about this other part? So it's very hard to justify this. Um, if you are assigning infinite value to the human lives and only finite value to your own life. But the one big argument that I've been trying to develop is sustainability. So because we think of these again, thinking of Pascal's wager as an extended activity, or thinking of medicine or environmental protection as an extended activity, it has to be sustainable. So if you were to just exhaust yourself, like even a doctor needs to rest, and if you're putting all your resources into saving lives and everything, you're not able to sustain that activity, and the net overall result is worse than if you set aside every year a certain amount of time for yourself. So it sounds kind of mundane, but in fact, I think there is a mathematical way to kind of work this out. And that's sort of gestured at in that paper I sent you, the follow-up paper a few weeks ago. So I think in the end, I'm not able to answer your question exactly now, but I think there is some proportion that is set aside for um, sort of finite pursuits, as it were, and some proportion for environmental protection, and analogously in the Pascal case. And it's not a great answer, and it's probably still not going to be enough to fully address this concern. That is, if you still are thinking of this reward as infinite, and we're just worrying about sustainability, that's not the whole story, right? Like, it's as if in the NASA case, it's as if I'm saying what really, really matters is asteroid stuff, and all this other stuff, NASA is doing it so that Congress doesn't cut its budget. If it doesn't have the Webb telescope and Mars missions, Congress will cut NASA's budget and it won't be able to deflect the asteroid, right? And that's not quite right, right? It's not. So I don't think I'm there yet, but I think arguments that bring in these kind of real world considerations about resource allocation are really important, both for the Pascal's wager and the environmental case. So, and I think that's why I think that's for me the real enduring interest of Pascal's wager is this, that we need this way of thinking about non-standard decision theories that let us deal in a kind of simple way with enormously important bad outcomes or good outcomes. So anyway, that's sort of if nothing else comes of this, like that people are seeing that there's something interesting about these non-standard approaches to decision making. That's I'm happy with that.
Well, so that leads into my previous analogy. So let's say that in the case where there's one God and you allocate some resources into trying to achieve the infinite reward of the God, and you also allocate some resources into your personal finite life. Now let's suppose there's infinitely many gods, like there's infinitely many possible asteroids, volcanoes, different ways you could die. Now, what do we do? Do we add more resources away from our personal life to each of these potential outcomes? Or do we
Yeah.
take the same amount of resources that would be invested into that one God and divide it among the most likely outcomes of the possible infinites?
I think it's going to be the second, most likely, because like that is you're still like, if you're thinking about one God, one possible God, and you think only one. Um, I think you can factor this decision. First, there's a decision about how much resources to set aside, whether it's based on sustainability, or actually the other argument I have, there's really two big arguments I have for not putting everything into wagering, and like basically spend your entire existence praying and wearing sackcloth and ashes, and like there's one argument is sustainability. The other is um, practical, very practical, that you may not actually have any impact on your degree of belief. Like that there's a limited amount of possibility for you to actually increase your belief. So, and here the analogy I have is with another environmental example. Sorry, this seems like a digression, but so we had this example where I live in British Columbia, and we have all this wonderful old growth forest. And there's a big argument how much of this should be set aside, and preserved, and how much should be logged. So, and basically, I think that the principle should be that once you get to the point where you should allow logging because it's important, commercially important for people's livelihood, but once it starts to impact the very survival of the forest, like it starts to have an impact on the probability that old growth forest will survive, then you should arguably, if you regard this as a catastrophe, that's where you stop logging. So what's the analogy with Pascal's wager? Well, if if actually taking, if suppose you take it seriously, like you've been willing to move into this space with me, which isn't your view, but if you take, you have a higher probability of heaven if God exists, and you think that wagering, like taking steps to bring about belief, you think that it can have some impact on your probability. But if it's limited, like basically, there's a limited amount of resources that you can devote that will actually have any positive impact on your probability. That sets a bound for how much resources you should devote to wagering, right? So there's really these two arguments for limiting the amount of resources you devote to Pascal's wager. One is sustainability, and the other is practical impact, right? And these are very un-Pascalian points. Like, I don't think he'd be happy with this, but they're my points. And I think those points are both insensitive to whether there's one God or many gods. So you basically set aside some part of the pot for yourself and for your finite goals, and then the other part is devoted to these Pascalian things. And it might be very limited for some people. And then you make this second decision about allocating it among the various possibilities, just like you do in the disasters case in the environment. And that part is, it depends on the nature of the disasters and or the nature of the many gods or whatever. So you're going to get different answers depending on what the assumptions are. So does that
So
help a
I
little bit?
get that if there is some limit to the pragmatic utility of sacrificing your resources, if it's just, if there's some point that beyond this it does nothing to improve your possibility, obviously there's no reason to invest. But let's say every cent of your utility could increase the probability slightly. Now, is there any
Yeah.
justification for not investing that cent in the infinite and instead investing it into the finite lifespan?
Okay, so that you're there's still the sustainability worry, but you're removing the practical, the sort of, let's call it upper bound. There's the first, I had these two arguments. There was this upper bound idea that beyond a certain amount of resources, you're not going to impact your product. So you're removing that and saying, every additional hour you spend in church, every additional dollar you donate to
Well,
some
say
religious
there's a God that
foundation.
says you must do this all your life, and if you
Yeah,
just stop doing this once, you go to hell.
right. Okay, well, I think I don't have a way, let's see, other than the sustainability, that you still need to be able, like, what you're trying to maximize is your lifetime devotion to, let's, even if your highest priority is the wager and this infinite reward or whatever, you still want to maximize that contribution. So I think the sustainability considerations are still going to impose some limit to how much you invest in wagering. Um, but you are removing this other point I had about a practical upper bound. So, and I don't have a good. I do admit that given the framework I've set up, you know you're kind of at the mercy of your own preference structure or something like that. Like if your utilities are endlessly capable, your probabilities are endlessly capable of rising. Now the other, actually, there is one escape here, which I don't know, which is if you're very easily moved to probability one. Like, I don't know if this is good, but if if you could pretty quickly get up to almost certainty, then you also wouldn't need to keep spending additional resources, right? Like, but I don't actually think that's very, like, I'm not too happy about that answer. Like,
Well, yeah,
I think
there's
most people,
a few branches of Christianity where once you're saved, you're always saved, and so once you convert and
something
get
like
baptized,
that.
you're
Like,
done. You're
I
done.
don't know. I mean, I'm happy with healthy skepticism. I don't think the probability should ever get even close to one. Like, but I'm just saying that would be another, like, just from the decision theory perspective, that might be another way. to avoid this, but I admit this is a weakness that I don't think I've reached the end of the story here in terms of answering. I think there's a real worry here about. I think there is a third answer, which is, and this one is much harder, which is, um, I do think we should value our lives as like there's a kind of a universe. Each time we decide, let's take another analogy. Each time you get in the car and go to the movies, you're risking a car crash, right? Which is, let's call that an infinite loss. But going to the movies is a finite gain. So why do we ever do this, right? Well, if we're Pascalians, maybe we should just stay home all the time. But we don't behave this way, and I think it's because a life that you live in. First of all, you can't totally prevent a danger of death, no matter what you do, even staying home. But more than that, I think even though we don't look at this in the terms of an individual choice, we think a life where you just do nothing at all and are paralyzed by this fear is a kind of infinite loss as well. Like, it's not literally infinite, but in this relative sense that I'm trying to defend, where like nobody would prefer that life, the life where you just stay home all the time, to the other life. And so I think you might well value, this is I think where I'd like to go with this Pascal stuff, that you might well consider a life where you did nothing but pray and go to church and everything as a kind of infinite loss as well.
Yeah.
And so this, again, it doesn't totally discount the wager, but it kind of limits. So this would be the final answer that I'd like to develop in some way. And it's sort of gestured at in some of these environmental papers as well, but I haven't yet really applied it to the wager.
Yeah,
So,
I like to
and
think about it the other way too, because I think if, say that we only have a finite life and there is no afterlife, then doesn't that finite life have infinite value because it's all you have?
yes,
And so if you
that's good.
sacrifice that finite life, wouldn't that also be an infinite loss? And wouldn't maximizing that life be an infinite gain because it has infinite value?
I think so. In Given the way I've kind of tamed infinite value, right? Like, it's not literally infinite. We don't think of infinite quantity of happiness or pleasure. We're just thinking in terms of preferences. Like, so A is B is infinite. I haven't tried to give this definition, but B infinite relative to A. If you prefer a small probability of B, no matter how small, to A for sure, right? How many people would prefer for sure a life of doing nothing, you know, to a a life where there's some chance of disaster? Nobody would prefer the cautious life where you do nothing at all. So I think we should live our lives as if they're kind of infinitely valuable. And maybe there's something Nietzschean about this, like this eternal recurrence idea. I've always thought of as related. Like, it's not like you live your life in over and over again, but you should make your decisions as if you're going to have to go through this life over and over again. And your decisions have that gives them literally infinite value in a sense,
Yeah.
like if it were going to happen. So I think that's true. And now you could try to turn the tables on the wager now and say, well, look, now this destroys the whole wager, because that was what was distinctive about it, was this there was this unique infinity in the table. So I'm actually, I think there's something distinctive still about the infinity in the wager, but it has to be balanced against these other infinities. And that's kind of, again, why we need a way to think about this stuff, that why we need this more sophisticated decision theory. And standard decision theory is really biased towards a kind of narrow utilitarianism, where there's always a trade-off, right? No matter what, if the probabilities are right and the values are right, you'd be willing to make these trade-offs. And I think there are some decisions in life where we don't want to make these compromises, and that's where these infinite values come in. They're not literally infinite. So I'll stop here. But so basically, I think what we're going to end up with, if this works, is something that isn't nobody's happy with, Not Pascal, probably not you, but I think maybe it will be interesting. So yeah,
For sure. Yeah, I think that is an interesting consequence or interesting entailment of the way you assess value to
yeah,
look at our finite lives as having potentially infinite value depending on how you define infinite. And I think that's
yeah,
in line with more like the secular viewpoint, because from a secular viewpoint, especially materialist one, our life is the only one we have. And so it is more valuable to us than the theist perspective, because they do have an afterlife from their perspective. And so the amount that we should value the finite life, I think, is going to also be contingent on your worldview, your background biases. And if you do have such a view that your finite life has infinite value, that would make it equally or more important than trying to devote it to pursue some afterlife infinite value.
yeah. It's excellent point, and I think so. I mean, on my view, I'm going to have this problem about these sort of different plateaus of infinity. Like there could be more than one, and how are you supposed to compare them, right? And like there is at one point, I kind of thought that I had this analogy with distant stars. Like it actually doesn't matter to us how far away like one star is or another star, right? Basically, if something is infinite, like here's a way to put it. Suppose you could have a pretty good infinite afterlife, like every day was finitely good, but it went on forever. Um, and you were given a chance to trade that for a super duper afterlife, right? But there's a 50% chance you could lose everything, right? Nobody's going to make that trade, right? So the idea is that if you get one level of infinity, you're not going to take a risk to boost up to another level. So there really isn't a big difference between these levels. But anyway, this is kind of getting sidetracked. So I don't want
Yeah,
to, but I think there is a relevant issue here, especially when we're talking about the environment. Like, do we save one species, or do we worry about, you know, do we give up on certain things to save more species or a whole habitat? Or so there are sometimes these trade-offs involving different goals that we think of as, highly important. So there could be some reason to worry about these different levels.
for sure. I find it hard to bring it into the climate change argument, because I don't see that as an infinite negative. I see like there was a recent study that came out that said if we do nothing, or the same amount that we've done to this point for climate change, the amount that of people who will die by 2100 is like 83 million or something like that. It's about a million a year, and in 80 years, about 7 billion people will have died. And so, the relative consequence of doing nothing about climate change still seems relatively small compared to the infinite comparison of like afterlife.
So okay, yeah, you don't think. I mean, I thought if we okay, when doing nothing, you mean okay, you don't mean actually burning up all the fossil fuels, like just sort of proceeding towards gradual elimination. Like
I think
I'm not sure what is meant by doing nothing, right? Like
like it. Let's
think,
suppose we continue using fossil fuels at the exact same rate to the point where there's, if we could continue to use them, and still had a way to provide food for everybody, because obviously if we had no fossil fuels, if we use them all, the most of our agriculture is going to be lost because they use fossil fuels. So if we found an alternative to supply the same resources, but only at the point where we literally used all of the available oil, coal, and gas, they're all gone now. The damage to the environment would essentially just cause about 100 million deaths of humans, and that's about it.
oh, okay, I haven't seen. I mean, I thought we would see. I saw one estimate, like I don't know, 8 or 9 degrees or something, Celsius temperature rise, um, which I thought would be pretty catastrophic. But maybe I'll need to look at some other sources because I thought it's and basically I think of catastrophe as a breakdown of like basically our government, our institutions will not be able to provide for basic needs. Our institutions would, our economy, our institutions would collapse. I agree that some climate changes we can adapt and not um, even though we don't like it, we can adapt and survive and feed people and everything. But I thought just burning through all the fossil fuels, that is ruled out. But I don't know. Maybe we don't want to get into this
No, I
debate.
think that's right. I think it's right that if you burn all fossil fuels, it goes up by like 8 degrees Celsius or something. That's
Yeah.
like, and do nothing else. But I think that we are going to find
Well,
alternative ways
yeah.
to.
I no. Actually, sorry, you're right. I have seen some recent estimates that are more optimistic about about you know the likely rise in temperature may not be much above 3.5 or 4 or something, which is still very bad. But yeah, so I mean, part of this whole thing of this decision about infinite, finite. I mean, I like standard decision theory. I'm not saying it's if you can reason. Basically, standard decision theory is ordinary cost benefit analysis, right? Like everything is finite. You're balancing values against probabilities, and most of the time that's just fine. But some of these really difficult decisions, there's a kind of a practical reason to model them uh, using infinite and finite, because you don't want to make the argument so sensitive to the probability that you just put off and let's just set up another scientific panel to investigate the risks and the probabilities. Like the whole spirit of this precautionary argument is we can't wait to get precise probabilities, right? And if the arguments hinge on exactly what these risks are, we're going to just set up another commission and never take action. So there's a kind of a pragmatism that you see in the environmental debate that is not there for the Pascal's wager
Yep. Yep.
stuff. So I agree, it's not perfectly analogous.
Yeah. For global warming, I think my biggest concern is if the temperature increase creates enough droughts to decrease the amount of arable lands, because then hundreds, like billions will die. That would be my biggest concern, next to Venus. Like, of course, if we go to Venus, everybody dies. That's
Yeah,
equally as bad. But it seems like the data shows that global warming could increase arable land, at least for the European countries. It would definitely be bad for Africa,
Canada.
but yeah, yep,
Yeah,
yep. So
yeah,
it's I don't know exactly what the data suggests. Like if we did see the worst case scenario of like the 8 degree Celsius increase that you presented, how many people would die from that?
yeah,
That's an interesting question that would be worth investigating. But
yeah. I don't know. So
yeah, we've been going for about an hour and a half. We do have some questions from the audience, if you don't mind.
sure, happy to do my best.
Travis Statham asks, "Are you a theist?"
Am I a theist? I, I, I don't usually like answering these questions because um, seems like I'm approaching this argument as a decision theorist. Um,
Yeah, so it doesn't make a difference to your argument whether or not you
yeah,
believe.
I think I'd like to keep these things to myself. Like I know people will form their own conclusions. I mean, I was raised in a religious tradition. I'll say that. So I take it seriously, but I'm trying to, present I'm thinking about these arguments seriously, but I don't kind of want to answer the question. I hope that's okay. Yeah. I'm not motivated by theism in making this argument. I will say that. Like I think this argument is interesting, and I hope it's not my intention to twist arms or anything like that. And I'm happy to abandon, like, when people make good points like Tom made about the if you start with equal probability, I'm totally happy to concede it. That this limits the power of this argument. So maybe that's enough of an answer to satisfy you.
JJ asked a question about a casino and gambling. If we apply the same statistics to gambling, how much of our income should we invest to gambling?
um, how much should we invest in gambling? I mean, generally, casinos are bad. Like, okay, if you go with expected monetary value,
The
nothing,
Powerball.
right?
How much should I put in the Powerball?
I don't know. I mean, if you go with the monetary value, you shouldn't ever gamble. But if you get some, you like there are these little. This is like first year decision theory. But if you distinguish between utility and monetary value, like if you desperately need money for some purpose, sometimes it's still rational to gamble, even though the odds are not in your favor, because it's your only way to get some sum of money. Like if you desperately need to take the bus and you need $10 and someone offers you a gamble that's not a very good gamble, but you have a chance of getting the $10. It might be rational. So I don't know. I don't gamble myself, so it's a little bit of fun. It's fine, but it's not a very good answer.
Winston's mom asks if you would explain your position on the Nash equilibrium.
Let's see. Would explain my position on Nash equilibrium. Do you mean there's different things people mean by Nash equilibrium? So I guess you just mean in game theory, like, because there's Nash equilibrium in the bargaining
So the full
problem
comment is objective facts are Nash equilibrium points in the
in
contest
the
of
context
competing
of.
wills.
Okay, let me see if I can understand this. I don't know this source. So generally, okay, it sounds like it's a game theory metaphor here. So this is a kind of a provocative remark, I take it, that let's say the competing wills, I'm guessing here, are different scientific or expert positions. Is that the idea? And then they basically compete. And the Nash equilibrium in game theory is, I'm not sure I can make sense of this. In game theory, Nash equilibrium, you have, there are two people playing a game. And the Nash equilibrium is a point where each party is doing their best given the other one's action, right? No one can do better with a unilateral change of action. That's a Nash equilibrium in game theory. So I guess the idea here is, it's not totally Pascal's wager. I'm not sure how this comes in, but maybe the idea would be, okay, let's say in general, the idea would be that different experts are playing some kind of game, I guess. I wish I knew this source. They're playing some game, and then they stake out positions, and they'll only change their position if, basically an equilibrium would be a set of positions that are an equilibrium. Nobody can do better by changing. I'm just not sure I understand this.
The
I
quote is
think
from
the idea is that there's a kind of stability. The objective facts aren't really objective. That's what it sounds like this quote is saying, that they're sort of social artifacts of this competition. Um, so I guess I don't like this view, um, but and I think in Pascal's wager, it's difficult because we started out by saying we don't have evidence, and Pascal himself says any objective claims about God are futile, that you don't, sorry, that we don't have evidence about this stuff. So however, you could say that, like, I'm just playing a game. Somebody like me, Tom and I are playing some kind of game to score points, and see what emerges from this as a kind of stable position. I don't know. I'm trying to make sense of this. I prefer to say I like a view when we're talking about debating. I'm happier with a pluralist view, that it isn't just a game, and that we're multiplying the possible views that come out, and people are welcome to consider multiple points of view for themselves, and each person should be thinking about these things, and nobody is legislating for anybody else. Like, I kind of don't think of myself as telling anybody what to think about this, but offering a different perspective. So I don't know if this is going to make you satisfied, but it's my best attempt.
Gotcha.
So,
Johann Pretorius asks, does he think Pascal's wager has a limited goal? How does he rate the argument's value on a scale of 1 to 10, and why?
yeah. Okay. So what do I say about this? I do think even the original argument has a limited goal. Even in Pascal's mind, it was like a first move to like his target audience were these sort of aristocrats, right? Parisian nobles who really have no use for religion, but they love gambling, and he's kind of appealing to their gambling instinct to, they have some residual attachment to religion, right? We're talking 17th century. These people think there's something to it, but they have no real use for it. So he doesn't think the argument is going to move them. I think he makes some remark that he says at least recognize. Actually, I wrote it down somewhere here. Um, yeah, he says at least get it into your head that if you are unable to believe, it is because of your passions, since reason impels you to believe, and yet you cannot do so. So he didn't think that his argument was going to bring anybody to believe. But and I think, okay, even in my sense, I think as an argument for taking religion seriously, it has limited value. And I've, in fact, been moving more and more in that direction of trying to limit the objectives for the wager. That said, I think it's among the most interesting philosophical arguments in history. And it has it links all this interesting stuff like infinity, God, decision theory, evidential versus pragmatic justification. Like it's a great argument and philosophers basically love arguments even when they trail a bunch of defects in their wake, like a big ship. They've got these arguments are defective, and we still love them. So that's what's great about this argument. It has so much baggage, but it still survives somehow. Still interesting, worth looking at. And it has links to these other topics, like I mentioned the environmental ethics. It also people have drawn other parallels. So you probably talked about the problem of induction, and this is an old problem in philosophy that our most basic scientific methods are lacking. There's a kind of a very simple skeptical argument that we can't justify any of our scientific methods, but nevertheless we persist, and we do so on pragmatic grounds. And there are arguments that they resemble Pascal's wager, um, arguments that for justifying certain methods. So I think in terms of its links to big areas of philosophy and its intrinsic interest, I would give it a 10. But in terms of its value as an argument in religion, 2 or 3 or something. Like I think it has to be limited, but it's important and interesting. So I hope that's a good answer.
He also asks if you could rate Pascal's wager as opposed to the argument from beauty or the efficiency of mathematics or those kinds of transcendental arguments. Like which one is this better than the other arguments? Because you mentioned
As
before that you think
arguments
the
for
other
the
arguments are
existence of God or
yeah,
something
yeah,
like that.
yeah. Because you mentioned that you
Uh,
don't like those very much. You're not very impressed by
Not that
those.
much. Like I thought about a little bit about the fine tuning argument. I don't know if that's similar. Okay, yeah. I mean, there's actually I thought a little. It's interesting. The stuff I do in analogies is not that related to Pascal's wager, but I did look at um, this sort of there was an argument by Mark Steiner about the unreasonable effectiveness of
Effectiveness of
analogies
mathematics.
in physics. Yeah,
Yeah.
and he looks at these great analogies that were used by physicists that they ended up like it looks like the physical universe is friendly to us. That like we have these weird mathematical symmetries, and then we apply them, and then the physics works out just fine, and it looks unreasonable. And Steiner ends up with this kind of supernatural hypothesis coming out of this. And I'm not very sympathetic to this. And the fine tuning argument is similarly, I actually wrote a critique of this. I had this chapter on probability in philosophy of religion, and I looked at 2 arguments. I looked at the fine tuning argument and I looked at Pascal's wager, and I was very critical of the fine tuning argument, but more sympathetic to Pascal's wager. I just think because the goal is limited, it's got more prospects. Like it's not completely dead, but I think there are just way too many problems with the fine tuning argument. I don't know. So And even the mathematics argument, or at least Steiner's version of it, like this sort of the applicability of mathematics to the natural world, right? I just think um, I'm not very impressed, and I'm more skeptical of that argument. Yes, Steiner, and unfortunately he recently died because of COVID. I think a year or two ago. So I think they're interesting. I think I like his. I'm glad he wrote. There was an article, or there was an original article, and then there was a book, and I'm glad he wrote this stuff. And I think they're fun examples to think about, and there is a kind of puzzle, but um, like when you think about analogies, I think there's a way to just apply to make sense of these analogies as perfectly reasonable and plausible without invoking some kind of supernatural explanation. So
Gotcha. Glebe Glorp asks, how did he conclude God would provide infinite reward instead of infinite punishment if he existed?
let's see. So he meaning Pascal or me?
I
I'm
think he
not
means you. So I think he means this is
okay.
talking about the
Yeah. So
basis of your
okay.
belief or
So
the starting belief. Like, why do you have
yeah,
a
the
starting belief?
initial table. I think in the initial 2 by 2 table, I put an infinity in the top left where you believe in God exists, and I didn't put a negative infinity in the bottom left where okay. So I think first of all, I'll just say there's no evidence for any of this. Like I totally willing to admit this that it's so uh, so you could put a negative infinity in, and it might basically one reason for not putting it in is it doesn't really change the basic argument, right? Like if you put a negative infinity, if Pascal's argument works without the negative infinity, then it will work with the negative infinity. It doesn't need this. It's it's basically an unnecessary assumption to put in a negative infinity in the bottom row. So I think that's
It would
perhaps
essentially be
why.
like two infinity. If you made two infinity in the top row, infinity
Yeah,
times
something.
two.
Yeah, something like that. Like it doesn't really change. You do, as you say, almost like a linear transformation, or just add infinity. It's not strictly kosher, but something. So it doesn't really change the basic argument. So if you're unhappy with the argument with finite, it's not going to make you happy. Like it's not going to convince you if you make it worse on the bottom row. So it wasn't really necessary. And then in terms, so it's not like we're ruling it out or anything. It's just like the argument is interesting enough without the negative infinity there. And then in terms of again, if you putting the infinity now, there are a lot of people who really end up rejecting the infinity. They just say it causes so many problems. I haven't even talked about all the problems with Pascal's wager that come out of infinity. Like there's even many more besides the many gods objection. So a lot of people end up saying, let's just use the finite wager where you put in a high positive value, right? And I think that loses the whole fun of the argument. Like what? So I keep the infinity there because it makes it a much more fun and interesting argument. I'm honest if I'm honest about it. Like it's as I say, it's the entry point to infinite decision theory. And if you put in actually there are two ways to in my mind to make the wager less interesting. One is to put a finite utility there. And the other is to introduce what are called infinitesimal probabilities. We didn't talk about those today, but and almost eerily, Pascal actually thought of them. Like if you read, he doesn't use the word infinitesimal, but he says something like this: there's one chance of winning against finitely many chances of losing. So that means it's a finite probability. And he says if there were one chance of winning against infinitely many chances of losing, then the argument might not work. I think he says something like that, which is like an infinitesimal probability. And a lot of people think that's another way to defeat the wager, is to say, okay, the probability that God exists is might be positive, but it's like infinitesimally small. And I agree that would, but then there's people who say, okay, what we now need is infinite reward and infinitesimal probability, and maybe they cancel out. Like I think once you've done that, you may as well just stick to the finite wager, because like we lose our grip on how to multiply infinite value again with infinitesimal probability. Why not just stick with finite payoff, finite probability? So I'm more interested in this weird version of the wager where you've got only finite probabilities and infinite payoffs. So that my answer is I don't really have evidence, but I think it's the way by far the most interesting version of the argument is with one infinite value, and then these other values finite, or to go to these many gods versions which have more than one column. How do you deal with multiple? That's fine. I think that's interesting, but I don't think it really adds a lot to put in a negative infinity. So there's my answer.
Gotcha. Johann Pretorius asks, if we start with the belief that Satan is the way to eternal bliss, what
What would it
would
take
it take to
to
convince
convince
him of
me?
that?
Um, yeah, I guess we're back to this issue of your initial set of probabilities and so if I'm going to be like orthodox about subjective probability, then the only basis for criticizing somebody's initial probability assignments is coherence. Like the probabilities have to be mathematically respectable. They can't add up to more than one. There's a bunch of rules, very simple rules of probability, and you can criticize people who have incoherent or inconsistent, mathematically inconsistent probabilities, but you can't really fault them for other wild assumptions. Somebody wants to believe in UFOs with probability 0.9. I can't say if this is their initial. I can say they should be responsive to evidence. There's this whole mathematics for updating your probabilities in response to evidence, and they should take into account what evidence there is, and the same is true of God. If that would be a whole other session, I guess, but whether there's evidence depending on what your conception of God is. But so I think if you start, what would it take to convince me of this? It would be hard because I think we don't really have evidence here. Um, but I couldn't really. I'm trapped by my own assumption that you can't criticize someone's initial starting point. You could apply this machinery, maybe. Like, I mean, at a certain point, it becomes hard on this assumption. It becomes hard to tell the difference between your Satan and a kind of conventional deity. Like, if Satan, in terms of Pascal's wager, what we're kind of projecting all this rich concept of God down to this little 2 by 2 table, right? And we're just looking at the reward structure. We have a very thin concept of the deity here. It's the being that provides this infinite reward. Like everything else about God is evaporating and not coming out in this framework. So your Satan looks a lot like Pascal's God in the way it's stated here, and I'm not sure what the difference would be. It's not showing up in the decision structure. So anyway, that's something of an answer.
Gotcha. All right, I think that's it for the questions. We've been going for about 2 hours. I really appreciate you coming on. It was a great
Oh,
conversation. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find out more about your work?
well, you know what? The only one I would mention might be this Philosopher's Magazine article that I sent you, because that's only 5 pages long, right? And it kind of shows why I think the argument is interesting. I know, is that I don't have
Yeah, I can put a link to it in
yeah,
the
I sent
description.
you that. I sent you the full issue. That's an interesting publication because they're sort of, they try to get people who are competent to write little articles. There was a bunch in that issue about God, which I'm guessing is a big interest for this audience. And again, like I know a lot of people are very, uh, you know, skeptical, and that's great. But I think it's wonderful that people are still interested in these arguments. So that is the one reference I would mention. There's
Gotcha.
also Alan Hayek has a really nice Stanford encyclopedia of philosophy article on Pascal's wager. So that, and he's very balanced. So that the SEP is a free resource. Anybody can look at the Stanford Encyclopedia. So, and that has a lot of links to different articles on Pascal's wager.
Cool.
So,
Perfect. Thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate it, and I
oh,
hope you
there it
have
is. He's
a
put they put in the philosophers. Somebody's put in this link. Was
yep.
that you,
No, that was
Winston's
Winston's
mother?
mom. Winston's mom, she posts a lot of the links that we're talking about. Whenever we bring up a topic, she'll post like a link to it.
That
She
was
does that very
amazingly
consistently.
fast. So
Yep.
that's great.
Thank you
Okay.
to Lewis's mom. Thanks again. I really appreciate you coming on, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, and I hope everyone enjoyed it. I certainly did. And also, part of the reason I did this is see what I could learn, and I think I learned a lot. So I really
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Awesome.